My apartment is haunted. I'm 20 years old and live in a fairly small apartment complex. I live here with my husband and 2-year-old daughter. We've lived here for about a year and a half, and the weird stuff started about 8 months ago. In my apartment, there are 2 bedrooms, and in my daughter's room, there is a utility closet and a regular sliding door closet. In my room, one whole wall is basically a closet with 3 sliding doors. You may be wondering why I'm explaining closets. Well, this is because that's where all the creepiness started. One huge OCD tick of mine is closing doors. I cannot stand doors being open for no reason. So every door in my home is shut almost 24/7. Or so I thought. One day while I was visiting my cousin, who lives one apartment building over from me, for an all-day occasion, my daughter was gone with family for the weekend, and my husband was at work. Some odd stuff happened. My husband made it home first, and only went in for about 5 minutes to grab something out the kitchen and bring it over to my cousin's place. He verified that I indeed had closed every door while he got home. After sitting around and chatting with my cousin for a few more hours, we went home. Walking through my front door, I felt like something was off. It was pitch black, but I chalked it up to my husband shutting off the stove light, which in itself is still odd. Stumbling for the light switch, we find one of my daughter's toys placed in front of the light switch, where in the dark you could easily trip over it. This was sign too that something was off. I knew for a fact that it hadn't been there where I'd left earlier. I brushed it off and continued on getting settled in for the night. Later, while walking down the hall, I stopped dead in my tracks, 1/3 of the way down the hall, when I saw my daughter's bedroom door slightly ajar. Had my husband been in there? I could have sworn he was in the living room the entire time. But then I heard it. The closet door, her closet door, in the pitch black of her room, had slammed open. I stood frozen for a moment before slowly peeking around the corner of her doorframe. Nothing. The door was closed, but something else catches my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I see it. A small light. A flashlight that had previously been in the bottom drawer of the kitchen. It sat in the center of my daughter's bed, with the light illuminating the corner behind her bed. I approached it slowly, and the moment my hand connected with the light, a button-operated toy began flashing behind me. You heard that right. This toy that you have to manually press buttons onto to turn on was flashing while I was cornered in my daughter's room. I felt my heart was just about to force its way up my throat. I couldn't breathe until, like a hero out of a movie, my husband walked in asking what I was doing, and I left the room quickly. A few nights later, my daughter is still out with family, and me and my husband are in bed. It's the middle of the night, and I'm having the weirdest dream. I dream that I'm lying awake in bed, and there is a dark shape in the darkest corner of my room. And it startles me awake, or so I think. I wake up in another dream with this tall, dark figure bent over my bed staring down at me. This time I'm jolted awake, and I'm trying to catch my breath. While I sit in the silent dark, my husband is sleeping, and I'm essentially alone. That's when I hear it. My closet door is shaking back and forth on the track, not like being blown by wind, but like someone is shoving it trying to get out. At this point I'm in tears and shaking my husband awake, and the moment his eyes open it stops. I get frustrated and cry harder, because now I feel like I'm going crazy. But this entity obviously isn't done yet. Night after night of listening to toys coming on alone, and closets opening and closing, does it finally happen. I have this problem with my eyes called optic neuritis, which causes me to occasionally lose my eyesight when I stress out too much. The reason I tell you this is because the night my husband finally got to see what I was talking about was the night I lost my vision for a few days. We were in bed sometime at night and it's quiet. I'm really good at detecting sound since I'm basically blind every few months or so. When I hear a familiar click, I sat straight up in bed. Our hallway light is a twist light, so to turn it on you twist a little knob at the bottom and it clicks when you twist it. At the same time, my husband jumps out of bed because he sees the hall light flash on through the crack of the door. I'm panicking, but I know that he is finally going to understand what I've been suffering through. He opens the door, and from what he told me, every door in the house was wide open. After a long night of closing doors and tear-filled apologies, we finally pass out from exhaustion. My daughter comes home and is acting strange, talking to walls, sitting in her closet, and pointing at corners. This scares me, but my husband says it's normal kid stuff. And before bed, my daughter and I are in the living room, and she's using her potty chair when she points into the kitchen and says, "Push it off." And within seconds, a glass is flung from the counter at the wall and lands upright on the floor. I'm traumatized living in my apartment. One thing more happened yesterday when me and a friend were sitting in the living room with my daughter, and she gets up and runs to the open door. I assume my husband is home because before she gets there, the doorknob starts turning like he's trying to unlock it. And the moment she unlocks it, the door starts to open but slams before she can pull it open. I'm confused at this point, and so is my friend, so I check the door and nobody is even near it. I live at the top of some stairs, so I'd hear someone running down the stairs if it was a joke. My daughter is visiting for holidays with family, and I'm alone. While I'm video chatting with my mother, she stops mid-sentence and says hi to my husband. I'm confused and think that she can see the confusion on my face because she begins to look confused as well. I remind my mother that I'm alone, and she goes pale, explaining that she had just seen the shape of a person standing in the hall behind the couch where I was sitting. Moments later, after I walk through the house with an old pocket knife in hand, I find nothing. But now my mum and I, at the same time, ask, "Is that running water?" I look around trying to find the source of the sound, checking every bathroom. Not a drip. Then the sound sounds like it's coming from the kitchen. Nothing again. Frustrated, I stomp back to the bathroom, and my skin begins to crawl. The sink is on full blast. How? Confused yet again, I walk back into the living room, phone still in hand, talking to my mother, and the wall behind me that connects the living room and my daughter's room. There's a loud bang, like someone hit the apartment wall very hard. I spent an hour waiting outside my apartment on the phone with my mum, waiting for my husband to get home and survey it further before I entered. This happened years ago, but still affects me to this day. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home. I was up late one night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot, and I had the window open as I sat and folded clothes. It was around 2 a.m, and the next thing I knew, there was a hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand flew back out. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was just my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window and just saw the figure of a man staring back at me. I ran into my brother's room and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They found nothing, warned me and my parents to lock the windows and doors, and left. We were all still shaken up, and my mum had a feeling that he would come back. It turns out her mother's intuition was right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After 20 minutes or so, she saw a man dressed in black who slinked into our backyard along the tree line, as unfortunately there wasn't a fence on that side. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to another tree and hid there, slowly working his way towards my window. My mother yelled something to him and he took off running. The police returned but couldn't find a trace of him. I never opened that window again, not even the curtains. My parents installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited, as this was our first place on our own. The apartment wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken, but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was creepy, but I vowed to be vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance near the lights, but often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would often have to park further away on darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time, a flower was left, which I always threw on the ground. But once, a pair of men's underwear was left. And even more creepily, there was an occasion where a bag of Tootsie Rolls, as they were my favorite candy, were left as well. This made me wonder if the person knew me personally, and I started to become suspicious of everyone. There was a laundry in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I started to fold, I realized all of my undergarments, bras and panties were gone. Another week, I had a male friend over from school, and his tires got slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. The letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. He noted things that proved he had been watching me closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease, and I moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. It was a secured building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were wary of Ashley's new boyfriend from the beginning. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her. Another reason was that the new boyfriend, Matt, was extremely good looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she wasn't the type you would typically expect someone like him to date. Ashley was thrilled. She'd never had a boyfriend and really felt like he was her Prince Charming. I, however, thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side and always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, leering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of a conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some random facts that were completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created a dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. They were only pictures of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage her from seeing Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just so strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversation down, and Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day I came home from work and found Matt on my couch alone drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work and she told him he could stay to just hang out. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. About 30 minutes or so later, he knocked on my door and suggested we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that perhaps I ought to give it a try. He put on a movie, and I tried to just focus on that because I didn't want to talk. At one point, I glanced over to Matt, and he was staring at me with a smile on his face. "What?" I snapped at him, and he just continued smiling and said, "I just can't believe it." "Believe what?" I asked him. He said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing on my body. I excused myself, went to my room, and locked the door. Another month or so went by, and I had managed to avoid being home for as much as possible, anything beyond sleep and showering. Matt practically lived there and had even brought a bunch of his things into Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge bouquet of flowers on the table and an already opened card propped up next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo had wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. Without even reading the words he wrote, I was shaking. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one my stalker had sent. I had kept them as evidence and dug them out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique and identical. Matt was the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on their way, I called Ashley and asked her to come over. She was at work, but said that she would be there when she could. I was terrified to tell her because I knew she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her, and they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything, and he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place he said he had worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state, and she had never met a friend of his because he said they had a falling out because he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. It was all lies, and in the end, she was dating a stranger. We don't even know if Matt was his real name. The cherry on top of this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left everything when he disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through everything. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments, there were about 10 pictures of me, all taken from far away, with the exception of one of me sleeping. The sheets were current, so I knew it had been at my current apartment before I started locking my bedroom door. A few pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which made us link that it was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shudder to think of what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with red lipstick, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, and a few other random sick souvenirs. The police never tracked him down. I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I had been considering and got the hell out of there. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger, maybe misplaced, for believing all of his lies and letting him get into our lives. I don't know what his endgame was. Would he have tried to hurt me? Or was he simply content with being in my world? I will never know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. I am married with children and know that he moved on to torment some other poor woman. But every time I visit my hometown, I tense up and keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again. For the past number of years, I have been working in a moderately sized amusement park in the middle of the city. I am at the admissions desk, meaning that the work is quite administrative, answering the phones, responding to emails, and admitting customers into the park. Being in the middle of the city, you do meet a lot of interesting characters, from old locals to traveling tourists. For the most part, I do enjoy the work that's involved, but every so often you speak to a customer or receive a complaint which really doesn't do much for your staff morale. Yet, I do always try my hardest to keep positives. Over the years, I've seen plenty of people stand in front of me at the front desk. There have been drunks, stoners, happy and sad people, angry parents, and an abundance of complaints to top it all off. But in that time until last week, a customer had never angrily threatened me personally before. So for some context about how this conflict began, the specific amusement park which I work in has a family loyalty system in that you can purchase a ticket which is valid for a set number of people to visit the park as many number of times as you'd like within 12 months. If they wished, they could come every single day of the year using this ticket. Now the only catch is that it's only valid for the people who are named on the ticket, as well as there being photographs on the ticket once it's scanned through, so that we can identify who the ticket is valid for when they arrive. Now some procedures are in place so that the tickets can't be misused, otherwise it could be passed around by neighbours and friends and family, and we'd essentially be letting people in for free. Basically, we say a group of 4 arrive to the park, and only 2 are named on the ticket. Only those 2 would be allowed in under that ticket. The other 2 would need to pay for their admission, obviously. Now if a ticket is given to an admission staff member, and no one present is named or photographed on the ticket, it would be retained by the staff and be sent back to the owners with a warning. If it happens a second time, said ticket will be cancelled. With this in mind, last week a family of 4 approached my till and handed me one of these loyalty tickets. Upon scanning the ticket, I noticed that none of the people in front of me were present or were photographed on the ticket. The biggest giveaway was the father of the family on the photograph was in his mid-30s, with cropped black hair. The man who was in front of me, was in his early 60s with long grey locks. Seeing this, I asked the guests if the ticket was theirs, as there was a different family in the photo in front of me, to which they replied, "Yes, our friends sold us the tickets before they moved to Poland. It's now ours." Now, selling or transferring these tickets is prohibited, especially without the notification of the amusement park beforehand. And 99 times out of 100, it was sold to us by our friends is the excuse used when the ticket is just being borrowed amongst friends. After hearing this and clarifying that no one there had been on the ticket originally, I informed the father that unfortunately I would not be able to use this ticket today, and their admission fee of $15 per person would need to be paid. The father asked for the ticket back, to which I told him I couldn't do. We would retain the ticket and it would be mailed back to the original owner by ourselves. When he heard this, the father's demeanor changed completely, and he held out his hand ordering me to return it. I don't usually do well in confrontations and try to avoid them when necessary, but the way he spoke to me rubbed me the wrong way, and I insisted that it was out of my ability to return the ticket. He once again ordered me to put the ticket in his hand, pointing to his hand with an increasing level of anger in his voice that sent chills down my spine. He even told me he would personally give it back to the owners himself, despite them having to move to Poland in his story. This continued back and forth for a minute or two, and realizing I wasn't going to get anywhere by arguing with this man, I placed the ticket behind the counter and was looking for a loyalty ticket application form to show him where it states the consequences of misusing the ticket. As I was pulling out the form, the man lunged over the counter to grab the ticket. When I swiped the ticket onto the floor out of his reach, he then lunged for me, but couldn't reach. That's when I lost all patience with the man, raised my voice and told him he couldn't do that. I picked up the ticket and informed him I was taking it into the back office for it to be cancelled. At this stage, a security guard approached and told me to find a supervisor to speak to the man. I went into the back office to tell a supervisor what happened, and they took the ticket and came back onto the floor with me. The man was now in a heated argument with security over how I had stolen the card which he had brought originally. My supervisor checked the ticket once more, confirmed that it was being misused, and told the man once again that the ticket was going to be cancelled. He proceeded to argue with her, growing more and more frustrated and changing his story from before. Apparently, he was now the original owner of the ticket, and he didn't know who the family in the photo were. It was clear that if his family hadn't been there, he would have picked a fight with her, the security guard, or perhaps even myself, as he was starting to escalate into hysteria. After some time, he calmed down enough to throw $100 at me and pay the $60 fee for his family. As I was handling his change, he leaned in close and said softly, "Remember, the world is a small place. I will see you on the street one night, and you will wish you never met me." He left, and I continued to serve 2 or more customers in somewhat of a daze, before the park manager came over to my till and invited me into the office to explain what happened. After I explained the incident to the manager and told him what the man had said to me in the end, the manager called for a number of security guards to remove him from the park, and this was achieved in under 30 minutes. What has been described to me as violent oppression. I don't know how he was removed, I wasn't there to see it, but his family was allowed to stay. The rest of the day went on without incident. The park opens at 8 PM usually, yet if it's particularly quiet upon closing time, some of the admission staff are allowed to leave early, while the guests exit the park. On this day I was relieved at 7:30. I don't have a car, but luckily my sister was on her way home from work and stopped to collect me. I waited in the office until her arrival, chatting with the supervisors and making light-hearted talk about what had happened during the day until my sister texted me, letting me know she was right outside the admissions building. On my way out, I was scanning the car park, and on my way over, I saw the man from earlier, with greasy grey hair sitting in his car, staring right at me and watching me approach. For a split second, I thought that this was the moment of reckoning he had told me about, before realizing that he was probably just waiting for his family to come out of the park, since he hadn't left his car to teach me a lesson yet. Despite this, he never took his eyes off me as I passed his car, and looked at me with nothing but pure hatred. I've genuinely never seen someone look at me that way before, and it half terrified me. A week after or so passed, and I didn't run into the man since. No phone calls or emails from him either, so I'm now in the clear. Either way, angry guy who threatened me at my work, I know the world is a small place, but please, let's not meet again. At one time, my parents owned the house my brother and sister-in-law now live in as a beach house. When I stayed there alone, the weirdest things would happen, like odd noises coming from the kitchen in the middle of the night. If I was there with certain friends of mine, it would be a different story. There are two incidences that stick out in recent memory. The first one took place when we were sleeping on the futon in the living room, which we did because the only beds we were allowed to sleep on were extremely uncomfortable, so we just used them to hold our clothes and toiletries. I have extremely bad eyesight, so while watching TV that night I was wearing my glasses. Then when I decided to go to sleep, I took them off and set them on the arm of the futon folded up so they would be handy in the morning. Well, that turned out not to be the case. I reached over to grab them and they were gone. I wanted to be sure I wasn't jumping to any conclusions, so I started looking in all the places they could logically be, between the futon arm and mattress, under the futon and under the bookcase, in the bathroom, etc. But I couldn't find them. Annoyed but wanting to proceed with the day, I put on my contact lenses, and Tracy walks into the bedroom where we all had our stuff, and comes back saying, "You've got to see this." After I followed her in there, she lifts up one of her shirts, and lo and behold, there are my glasses underneath it, open and upside down, as though someone had been wearing them. Now keep in mind, Tracy does also wear glasses, but her prescription is widely different from mine. This means she would have noticed immediately if she had picked up mine by mistake, and even then, why would she have put them under her shirt? Neither of us ever had any history of sleepwalking, so I doubt it was something like that. Unless she confessed it herself, I refuse to entertain the notion this could have been a prank. The second incident is even more inexplicable. This time I was staying with Tracy and a guy I was dating at the time who we called Big John, since he was literally about 7 feet tall. Tracy slept on one of the two tiny rock-hard beds in the spare room, and John and I slept on the futon. Next morning, John and I were both awake, but not really moving or speaking yet. I felt him turn to look at the bookcase. That was about 3 feet from the futon, but he didn't move in a manner that would have allowed him to touch anything on it. After he looked away, a picture of my brother and dad fell off its shelf, where it was a couple of inches back from the edge, and fell to the floor and shattered. After my parents sold the house to my brother, his stepson would complain about things like his dresser drawers opening and shutting by themselves at night. My sister-in-law is not the type of person to allow something like that to scare her children, so she firmly told the entity that it was perfectly welcome to stay, but messing with the kids was not going to be tolerated. After that, things calmed down until they expanded the house, so my sister-in-law had to reiterate her original terms. After my parents divorced back in 2006, my mum could no longer afford to pay the mortgage on the house which we were living in, so we were forced to move. I was an angry child at the time, angry that we had to move out of this house. I loved that house. My mum and sister fell in love with the house that was across the street from a cemetery. I was terrified of cemeteries at the time, so living across from one was something out of my worst nightmares. We did, however, end up moving in. My mum, my sister, our 2 dogs and our 1 cat. Things were quiet for several weeks while living there, and it wasn't until 6 months later that unexplainable happenings began to occur. 6 months in, I woke up to a loud crash and looked over to the side of my bed. My Labrador was lying on the floor having a massive seizure. He never had had a seizure before, so this was terrifying. He had at least 3 in a row, and that day he was diagnosed with epilepsy. We'd had him for 5 years, and he had never once had a seizure before, so it was odd that he'd have one now. My sister adopted 2 kittens, and we had a cat tree that they would sleep on. It sat next to the recliner where I'd sit most of the time, so I could use it as my laptop. One day, I was sitting there in the recliner, and her cat, Tigger, was fast asleep on his tree. The house was completely silent, and then suddenly, Tigger shot off the tree like someone had come up from behind him and screamed as loudly as they could. It kind of reminded me of a scene from Ghost, when Patrick Swayze's character screamed into his cat's face to attack his murderer that was in his house. That cat was freaked out for the rest of the day and stayed up in my sister's room for the remainder of that day. The family cat, Addix, who never had had a sick day in her life, suddenly had 2 massive strokes the same night, within 30 minutes of each other, and died in my mum's arms a year after moving in. It wasn't just the animals that were affected though. Whatever lived there came after me. At 3:03 a.m. every night, my dog and I would be in a deep sleep, and at the bottom of the steps, it would sound like my mum stood at the bottom shouting, "Nick!" and it would wake both of us up. The first couple of times I would go see if my mum would be okay, and she'd be fast asleep. After that, I got into the habit of sleeping with my headphones on, so I didn't have to hear it. But even then, I'd still sometimes wake up to my name being shouted. Things would go missing in my house, not just anyone's things, but mine. I remember clearly that one night I had put my iPod on its charger before I went to bed. When I woke up the next day, my iPod was gone. It was nowhere to be found, and I searched everywhere for it. I gave up trying to find it after about a week, because there was nowhere else to look. Then about a month after it disappeared, I woke up, and the iPod was back on its charger like nothing had happened. I was working a job where I was closing the store almost nightly, so by the time I got home, I would be the only one awake, so I would sit in my living room with my laptop writing, when I would hear a whisper coming from the vents from the basement. It was a full conversation, and one time the whispers got louder, and so I took off upstairs with my dog. This was constant, until I moved out at 24, and I took my dog with me. The minute we moved out, his seizures stopped. He was a completely different dog. My stuff stopped going missing, and the whispers also stopped. It's been nearly 6 years since I've lived in that house. I was the only one who believed the house was haunted, and I do bring it up with other people. My mum, my sister, but they still insist that there's nothing wrong. Whatever was living there, I was a target, and so were the animals, and I never want to go back, and I'll never have to, because the house has been sold. I do wonder though, if the current owners experience anything like I did. A friend of mine used to work at Disneyland in Florida. He was standing at the entrance for the line and had to tell a family that their child was too short for the ride. They could switch off and ride the ride if they wanted, but one of them would have to stay with the child. They said okay and walk away. Well, the child was young enough to be wearing one of those leashes that you can put on your kid, and maybe 20 minutes later, we saw the kid a little ways away, by himself, tied up to a light pole. So my friend Rob resolved to wait a minute before calling it in. Maybe they were in the bathroom, not that that makes it okay. Anywho, 15 minutes later, the kid is still tied up, and so Rob calls security. It takes security maybe another 10 to 15 minutes to get there, so the kid has been tied up for at least the better part of an hour. They come and see the kid and say, "Hey, wanna come with us? We're gonna take you somewhere fun." And the kid is excited and goes with them. Rob's shift doesn't end for another 3 hours, and he doesn't see the family come back. While the next guy who comes and replaces Rob sees them come back later and freaks out. By the time the parents returned, they found a manager and found what happened. Their child was already with social services. They were from out of state, and they had to go back without their child and return at a later date for a court hearing. When I was a teenager, my family moved into a new house in Ohio. As soon as we moved in, my mother started saying that she felt the house was haunted, and she could sense a presence there. She said she heard someone call her name, and that she felt someone put a hand on her shoulder. There was one time, she woke up with someone holding her feet down, and she couldn't shake whatever it was and started screaming. She also heard muffled voices. We didn't believe her at all, until both my sister and I started experiencing strange things. My first experience was when I was reading a book in my bedroom at 3 a.m. I am a night owl, and it wasn't that unusual. Everyone should have been asleep, but suddenly I heard very faint footsteps right outside my bedroom door. They were too heavy to be my mum's or sister's, so I assumed my dad was walking around checking up on us. I sprinted to the door, and when I opened it, I was shocked to discover the hallway was dark and no one was up there. Our attic had several feet of fluffy insulation covering the entire area. There was nothing stored there, and at times you could hear steps coming from the attic, running up to the side of the house with the driveway, when someone was pulling up to the house, as if they wanted to see who had arrived. It was almost cool in the daytime, but terrifying at night. There was always something clicking loudly under my bed, as well as in the closet at night. I always tried to convince myself it was air vents. However, all the air vents were on the other side of the bedroom and never made clicking noises. I sometimes saw an outline of a person standing next to my bed, if my head was covered with a sheet, and when I'd pull it off, there'd be no one there. I'd hear sighs as if someone was standing right behind me, and there was one occasion where I heard a whisper, "Come play." I prayed a lot, and that usually helped. I'd also ask them to quiet down, and that helped too. One time, my boyfriend and I were doing homework in the basement, and heard the garage door open and the voices of my parents in the kitchen. We ran up to say hello, to discover an empty house. There was another time when my boyfriend stayed overnight. He slept in the living room, and in the morning he asked if we were playing a joke on him at night, as he kept hearing a ball bounce on the stairwell leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor and in the kitchen. But every time he got up to see what was going on, no one was there. I don't think we even owned a ball, and certainly didn't play with one in the house. One time my mum heard a baby cry outside of our house at night. We lived in a safe and perfectly normal suburb, and there was no reason a baby would be in our backyard. One day, a lid flew off a cooking pot and got halfway embedded into the kitchen ceiling. It wasn't a pressure cooker, just a regular lid and a pot. Another time we left for a family vacation, and my boyfriend was asked to take our paper in. He said he was in the house and decided to make my bed, as we left at some ungodly hour like 5 a.m, and I never got the chance to do it. He said at first he got a juice and felt like someone was breathing down his neck. He kept turning around to find no one there. Then he walked upstairs, and while he was making my bed, he felt something grab his leg from underneath the bed. He got freaked and ran out, and refused to enter the house again, and just diligently hid the papers behind a flower pot outside until we returned. My sister one night awoke to a black-caped figure standing silently in her room. She said there was also a bright orb near her window, as her window faced the backyard and trees, and being on the second floor, there was no possible source of lights from cars. She covered her head with the blanket, and when she looked out, the figure and orb were still there. She went back under the blanket, and after some time they were finally gone. Our cat disappeared without a trace someday as well. We are unsure if it's related. My dad was one person who never experienced anything. No voices, no steps, no TVs and radios blasting out on their own. He is hard of hearing, so that could have been a factor. But one thing he can't explain is waking up at 4 a.m. next to a lit tea light candle that he swears burnt out at midnight. The candle was right in front of his face, and he's extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he covered any electronic lights with napkins as they disturb his sleep. It eventually got so bad that I refused to sleep in my own bedroom, as I could feel someone moving around in the room at night, and I slept in my sister's room. My dad decided to call a medium, and the guy said that there were 5 spirits in the house: a boy, an old lady, a couple, and a very angry man. He gave us a giant candle with a cross and said to burn it in the bedroom of the youngest child, which was now also my bedroom where I slept in a sofa chair. The candle was in a big glass jar and was hefty. All night it kept shaking, and the glass kept making clicking noises against the counter it stood on. We were also to tell the spirits that this was our house now, and they needed to go to the light. Things improved after the visit, and shortly after I moved out to attend college, where I slept with the lights on, although I never experienced any paranormal activity in my apartment there. After college, I never stayed in the house for longer than a few days, always sleeping with the lights on, as the creepy feeling remained despite nothing noticeable happening anymore. Eventually, my parents sold the house. I worked for the Disneyland Hotel for more than a year. I work in one of the many departments that would need to deliver things from our department to the guest rooms when they needed them. One night, at around 11:30 at night, I was making a delivery when I heard a group of children laughing from the pool deck, which is surrounded by a gate. Since I was heading to a guest room, and they'd been given a wait time, so they'd know exactly when to expect me, I didn't stop to see who was playing in the pool and to check that they were being monitored by at least an adult. After delivering what the guest needed to the room, I headed back to where I was supposed to be waiting, when I heard more children laughing from the pool deck, as well as some splashing. Since the pool water itself is well lit and the pool deck is poorly lit, I expected to at least be able to see some kids playing in the pool and something resembling an adult within easy hearing range. By the time I had walked up to the gate, which is covered in plants, the laughing and splashing had stopped, and I could see that there was no one anywhere near the pool or pool deck. It really makes me wonder what I heard. While I know there have been deaths at the hotel and in its rooms, with the most recent death happening weeks before this posting, all of the deaths have been adults, making me wonder what I was hearing. I've also been deaf in my left ear since childhood, so any sounds I would have to have heard would have been quite loud. Christmas Day, mid-90s. I was about 6 years old. The house we lived in had a conservatory, which we used for family dinners. That Christmas, there was my parents and grandmother present. I was pretty young, so basically remember nothing else from that day, apart from the event that followed up, both of which are crystal clear in my memory. Dinner's ready, the TV gets turned off, and we all head to the dining table to start eating. Then we hear a deep gargling sound coming from the adjoining lounge. It sounds like a mix of choking, gargling water in the throat, and the way a singer sounds when a song is reversed. It was pretty disturbing. Everything goes silent. We all freeze and glance at each other, then start to try and locate the source of such a noise. We look around basically as the whole house is eliminating everything we could possibly think of as a potential source. As far as I remember, we eventually shrugged off the event and carried on with the day as normal. Now, the follow-up was sometime later. It was probably springtime. My dad likes his gardening, and about 3/4 of the garden were pristine. The very bottom, however, was my patch, and I could do whatever I wanted down there. I dug a hole, a big hole, that was perhaps 2 feet deep. I say a 12-foot wide hole when I found a set of top front teeth, which appeared to be set into pinkish stone. They were definitely for a human, and we didn't really investigate this much, as it was more curious. This wasn't the only incident at that house that was odd. Many years later, we found out that about 60 years prior, there was a stream at the bottom of the garden. While I've always had a keen sense of skepticism, my mother was convinced that the house was haunted, and later that the spirits had followed us to our new house. We had a few instances of banging and scratching from the attic, although in hindsight I'm pretty sure that was something to do with the heating system. The oddest experience was not necessarily that scary, but I was running up a really high fever one night. I was in bed and hallucinating all kinds of stuff, massive spiders crawling up into bed with me and things like that. My room was painted, but had a wallpaper border near the ceiling, and one of my hallucinations was of my uncle, an avid biker, riding along it. I started shouting his name at the top of my voice and getting really upset, and he died in a motorbike accident about a month later. This happened when I was around 11 or 12 during the summer holidays. So, I was a 5-foot male out of shape and very shy. I was traveling with my parents in Europe, and we had been to Barcelona and Paris before that, and our next destination was Tarragona in Spain, where an amusement park called Puerto Aventura was located. We had scheduled to stay there in one of the hotels for 4 days to visit the park, water park, and beach club. What I am about to relate to you happened on the 3rd day in the main park. It was getting late, and most of the areas of the park were closed, except for the Mediterranean area, as a show with fountains, lights, and fireworks was being held over the lake that night. As it was the week of the park's anniversary, I asked my parents if we could stay to watch the show, but they were much too tired after an entire day of running around the amusement park and needed to go to the information desk to make sure the things that we had bought were properly sent to our hotel room. I begrudgingly obliged. As we were at the information center, I felt the need to go to the bathroom. I asked my mother if I could go and where the nearest one was. Turns out the closest one was at the edge of the Mediterranean area. My parents were busy at the info desk, and I have no siblings, so they told me to just go alone. I wish I had waited for them to be done, so I could have gone with my dad, because what transpired was pretty traumatizing. I navigated back to the Mediterranean area and to the bathrooms. The whole area was pretty busy, and lots of people were crowded by the edge of the lake to watch the show that was about to begin. I entered the bathroom and went on to do with my business until I noticed a man looking towards me. I normally don't like it when people stare at me, as I was shy, but this time instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt in danger. I glanced back at this 6-foot tall man who was well built and in his 20s with very short hair, almost shaved, Caucasian and wearing a grey hoodie, dark jeans and black leather boots. It immediately struck me as the kind of person you wouldn't find in an amusement park. He was standing in front of the second urinal, as if using it, but I had the feeling he wasn't. I noticed him glance over at me a few times. I was done and eager to leave. I tried to pass behind him, and as I did, I noticed him reach for me. I barely avoided his hand as he grunted while I made a whimpering noise. The bathroom was very crowded, so no one noticed, and as I neared the exit, he left his urinal. I left the restrooms and looked over at the lake. The show had started. There were images being displayed on the water of the fountains with a projector, and loud music was blasting on all the speakers. I tried to blend into the crowd, hoping to lose him. After a minute of making my way through the cluster of people, I looked back, and not 10 meters behind me, there he was, following me through the same paths between the herd that had cut through. He now was wearing his hood up, covering his face, but I could feel him staring me down. I also noticed he was now wearing what I think were black, fingerless gloves. Alarms were going off in my head, as my previous stance on this situation went from weird and creepy to dangerous. I turned and started to desperately get to an area I could run in. About 15 seconds of squeezing through people, I reached the final stretch of the lakeside pathway. It was empty, too far from the main show for anyone to be there, yet the speakers were still playing loudly here. Ahead was a maintenance side path, with the gate slightly ajar, and to the left was a turn leading to the plaza, with the Info Central building. I ran as fast as my asthmatic, out-of-shape self could towards the turn. I could hear this man running behind me, his boots getting louder and louder behind me. He was gaining on me, and I started to panic. I even ran faster than I thought I could, but he was still getting closer. I had reached the turn and changed directions so fast I leaned towards the ground and nearly slipped. I felt motion beside me, as if someone had taken a swing at me, and I could hear a man complain in a language I couldn't recognize. My working theory is that it was Russian. I kept running through the plaza, directly to the information building, but I didn't hear the man running anymore. I turned and saw him slip into the service gate at the end of the street. I ran into the building, grabbed my mum's leg, stuttering and almost crying, but she was occupied with the lady at the counter, and though she saw me distressed, told me to go sit and wait, and tell her when we left. I protested, but she wouldn't listen, and was paying attention to the lady. As I walked over to sit on one of the chairs, I looked out the door and scanned the plaza with my eyes. I didn't notice anything at first, and almost looked away, but I saw something behind a direction sign next to a tree. In the most remote and dark corner of the plaza, it was the man. It felt like we made eye contact. I turned away and sat in the chair furthest from the entrance. When we were leaving, I looked over in the same direction again, and he wasn't there anymore. I told my parents, but since I had a vivid imagination as a kid, they chalked it up to me being paranoid because I was alone, and that, even if it were real, there were way too many witnesses for someone to try and pull something of the sort. I wasn't happy to be called a liar about this, but considering how thick-skulled my parents could be, I didn't insist. I had tried to forget this encounter, and was successful. But after running into the Let's Not Meet subreddit, and hearing other similar stories, this resurfaced in my mind. Now I realize how bad this situation was, and that the people around me at the time were distracted by the show, and no one would have been wiser if I had have been taken. No one would have heard me scream or struggle, and the fact that the maintenance gate was open and I saw the man enter it means I almost ran right to where he wanted me to go. To think I was almost taken right next to a crowd of people boggles my mind, and I've never gone alone anywhere in an amusement park since. I live in a house in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods, so it's always had that potential to be creepy, especially at night when all the deers, coyotes, and other animals are making noises in the woods. The house was built about 13 years ago by my family, so we are the only ones to have lived in it. I don't know anything about the property other than it's in the country by some cornfields and a few other houses. Ever since I was a kid, there has been one room in the house that has always given me a weird feeling when I was in there by myself, and that is my mum and my stepdad's room. Anytime I was in there alone, I just felt odd, like I was on edge. However, this could just be because my mum never really liked me in her room. It is just a feeling of almost being watched, or that I needed to hurry out of there. Like I said, it could be because of my mum's rule, so I'm automatically assuming this means my house is haunted. On Tuesday I was home alone, no pets, nothing, and I was getting ready to go out. My mum has this hair product in her bathroom which is attached to her bedroom that I love, so I stroll over down the hall in order to obtain some. As I was styling my hair, I hear a noise, like a smacking sound. I'm 100% certain of what I heard, as this sounded as if someone took their open bare hand and hit it off the wall 3 times. The sound seemed to have come from around where the door to her room is, or from the hallway where it opens up to a large entryway, because the smacks did not seem muffled, so it didn't sound like it was coming from another room, the attic, or any other part of the house. I immediately froze, because I thought I was busted by my mum or stepdad for stealing some product, and they were messing with me, or someone was knocking on the door to the house. I almost immediately left the bathroom and peered around her door down to the entryway to look at the door, which has a large glass panel. I saw no one standing there. I ran downstairs quickly to see if someone was pulling out of our driveway, like UPS or FedEx or perhaps even Jehovah's Witnesses, but there was no one leaving. We have a long driveway too, so it's not like someone could pull out quickly. Now at this point, I obviously start to freak out, and every horror movie I have seen and story I had read had come to mind. I grabbed my things to finish getting ready at my friend's house and left. I spent at least 15 minutes getting my things together, and in that time nothing else happened. But as I said, as soon as I had my things, I ran to my car and left. On a lighter note, I was caught by our security camera running to my car, in my PJ tops and shorts, with Uggs on my feet and crying. After the fact, it was kind of funny, but I was definitely terrified. For a long time now, my mum and stepdad have not gotten along. For years, there was almost constant tension of arguments, and that is the room where they both had to sleep together. However, they have recently decided to separate, so the arguments have all but subsided. My question is, could the years of hate, tension, sadness, and anger build up to create or invite something into the home? If this were the case, why was it showing itself now, when things are finally coming to a resolution, with both of them looking for new places to live? I, of course, called my stepdad in tears, suggesting a person could have even have broken in, as I was trying to rationalize it. He said he thought it could be a mouse in the attic. We live next to a field, remember? A loose side panel on the house from recent extreme winds, or ice from the ice machine in the kitchen. Now bear in mind, I've heard all these noises before. I know what they sound like, and I don't think that they're the case. He checked the cameras, and I was the only person to enter and leave. Of course, everyone thinks I'm overreacting, but I am confident in what I heard, and the fact that it gave me chills. I was in about 5th grade. My mum and I loved to go to Disneyland. We lived about an hour's drive away and held annual passes. One of my mum's favourite rides was the Tower of Terror, which I was very much afraid of because of the drops. Right in front of the ride is a little area for the fast passes. For anyone who's unfamiliar, there's small machines that you can get passes from to skip the line, but you'd have to do a whole different line. This is where I would wait for my mum and went on the ride. There was always a worker there, plus many others in viewing distance, and I had one of those flip phones in case I got lost. As I'm sitting there, I hear a worker behind me talking to a man, asking him to move out from the fast pass area since they were closing them off for the day. The man walked out and sat down next to me. He was about 18 to 20. He asked beforehand if I wouldn't mind if he sat next to me, and I said no since I didn't think anything of it, and there was plenty of space in between us. Now I'm a very friendly kid, and naturally I was going to start a conversation with him while I waited. When I turned, he was already looking at me. He stuck out his hand offering to shake hands with me, and gave me his name, which he said was Light. Now that I'm older and have watched Death Note, I'm sure it was a reference to the show. Anyway, I introduced myself to him, and we start to talk. As the conversation went on, he scooted closer to me. I didn't think anything of it because we were pretty far apart, and I figured he just wanted to be able to hear me better. It was a relatively normal conversation, asking where I was from, hobbies, and how old I was, until he asked, "Do you have a phone? What's your phone number?" Luckily, I had my phone in my bag, so I just said I was too young for one, and he followed up with this question: "Are you ticklish?" Remember, I'm a tiny 5th grade girl, and he had just told me he was 19. I froze, and felt all the adrenaline rushing into my body, as he proceeded to grab and squeeze very high on my thigh and the sides of my stomach. That lasted for 5 seconds, until I saw my mum, which prompted me to get up and run to her. As I walked up though, she looked really annoyed. She was looking past me, and behind me I hear, "Hi, I'm Light." He shook my mum's hand. "I was wondering if I could spend the rest of the day with you guys." My mum said, "No," and he walked away. I began bawling my eyes out to her. She explained the reason she looked so angry is because when I was a little kid, I used to invite people over to our house or to hang out with us, so she had assumed I had done it again. I didn't tell her about him touching until I began high school, which I definitely should have. But for some reason, I had this idea in my head that I would be in trouble if I told her. So creepy, Disneyland man, let's never meet again. For context, I am a shy 19-year-old girl who doesn't tend to go outside very often, other than when I walk my 2 dogs, walk to college, or go to the store. I walk my dogs in a small, almost triangle-shaped area with a small, slightly overgrown pathway, which was only used by myself and a couple of other dog owners on my street. The left side of the triangle is formed from a line with trees, with an old metal fence behind it. One part of the fence was broken and had a large gap in it, which led into a much larger field that was used for football practice and friendly games. The right wall of the triangle was created from wild bushes and shrubs, many of which were jagged and extremely overgrown. The bottom of the triangle is formed of an overgrown thick hedge. The pathway is in the center of this hedge. One night around the start of October, I was walking my dogs in the area, and something felt wrong. I felt like I was being watched. I ignored this feeling and told myself I was just being paranoid. My dogs were doing their thing when I heard leaves crunching from behind the trees. My dogs immediately turned to face the trees and began growling. I had never seen them react this way before, and the crunching sounded too slow for it to be a squirrel. I couldn't see anything since it was late, and there's no light in the area, but I bailed and pulled my dogs back and quickly headed home, still feeling like I was being watched, until I made it to my house and locked the door. The following few weeks were similar. Every night when I would walk the dogs in the area, I felt like I was being watched, despite not being able to see anyone there. On a couple of occasions, my small dog would stop what she was doing and stare at the trees and growl. My big dog would also refuse to enter the area on these nights. I put the feeling of being watched down to paranoia and guessed my dogs were just being weird. The week before Halloween, I was walking my dogs, but instead of feeling like I was being watched, I felt something different. I felt fear. I ignored the feeling and walked up the pathway. Both my dogs refused to follow until I had reached the end of the path. Then they both ran to me and started barking as they faced the area where the hole in the fence was. Like I said, the area is dark and overgrown, so it is hard to see. However, I swear that I saw the outline of someone crouching half hidden behind the tree that was next to the hole in the fence. I didn't stick around long enough to investigate. I pulled the dogs back and left as fast as I could. I looked behind me as I was leaving and saw that the hedge was moving. Nope. I ran, and my dogs did their best to keep up with me until we got back inside. I decided that from then on, I would just walk my dogs elsewhere, which I did, and the feelings of being watched at night and my dog's weird behavior subsided. Then Halloween arrived. I had decided to do some Halloween baking and made a batch of cupcakes. I went to decorate them and discovered I was out of icing bags, so I walked to the store. This is only a 15-minute walk on foot, so it didn't take long to get there. I buy the icing bags and a few other things, then begin to walk home. My street is like a side street that leads off on a long straight road, so I have to walk down this road to get to my street. As I was walking down the long road, a guy in a black car that was already parked on the road stopped me. "I'm looking for a friend who lives in area, but I don't know where he is," he said in a slightly broken English. The guy begins to describe a guy who matches his own description. "Nope, sorry, I don't know anyone around here who matches that description," I said. The guy then asked me if I was Irish because of my accent, which I tell him I'm not. He asks me how long I've been living in the area, and I reply with, "my whole life." He then begins to ask me more things about myself. I find this extremely weird, since he had now stopped asking for directions. "Do you know what house number your friend stays at or anything?" I asked. The guy stops and stares at me for a moment, then says, "Look, I'll be honest. I don't have friends who live in area. I saw you in store and thought you looked interesting. I've seen you before, actually." I laughed awkwardly and mentally prepared myself to start running at any moment if anything happened, but I knew I couldn't outrun a car. "You just look so interesting. I wanted to know more about you. I had to find a way to approach you. You're just so... You know, I fancy you so much. I had to talk to you. I have been seeing you walking your dogs too. You ran before I could talk to you then." I'm horrified at this point and just stand there like an idiot, mentally freaking out. "How old are you?" he asks. Without hesitation, I lied and said 16, in the hopes it would scare him off. He hints his steering wheel with his fists and says, "Too damn young. Are you sure you're 16? I nod and walk away, trying to keep my cool, making sure I wait for the sound of a car leaving before I reach for my phone, which was in my back jean pocket. I immediately text my recently ex-boyfriend, freaking out over what happened, and tell him everything. He keeps messaging me and makes sure I got home safely. Not only had this guy been watching me walk my dogs and pretty much confirmed that he was the guy behind the tree, but this guy has been watching me long enough to know the route I take home, despite not leaving my house very often or venturing far from my house when I do go out. I hope that the fact I lied about my age will keep him away and ensure that we never meet again. When I was about 11 or 12, I went to an amusement park called King's Island with my sister, grandma, and mother. Since we knew the area well and had phones on us at the time, my mum and grandma would let my sister and I roam on our own to ride whatever we wanted. My sister and I just got done at the arcade, and as we left the arcade, we made our way towards the Diamondback, which is a roller coaster. Before we got to the Diamondback, I told my sister we should go on the Zephyr, which is like a swing carnival ride. I was on the left side and my sister on the right. As we were in line, a man who looked to be 30 or 40 walked up to me. He put his hand on my lower back area and walked alongside me. As I gave him a dirty look, he immediately apologized and claimed he thought I was his girlfriend. Then he walked away like nothing had happened. I bawled my eyes out and immediately ran back to find my mum and grandma and explained what had occurred, and we decided to leave the park at that moment. While I was young at the time, I had heard enough stories about people taking other people to know that it could have ended a lot worse. Considering the fact that I was 11 while my sister was 9, and he was around 30 or 40, I remember thinking there were most likely no way he thought I was his girlfriend, or that my sister was anywhere close to his age. Maybe he did think I was his girlfriend and that it was an honest mistake, but either way it creeped me out a lot, as unlikely as that scenario is. Creeper at the amusement park? Let's not meet again. I lived for a short while in an ex-Yugoslav country in the Baltics. There I met a bunch of totally weird men that I still can't comprehend. Some of it was culture shock, but most, I still maintain, was borderline illegal. I was volunteering in a youth center and lived less than a 2-minute walk away on the main road and across a small car park. I was 19 at the time. This story begins 40 kilometers away in another town, where myself and quite a few other volunteers from around the country were invited to a party early in my placement. We were given cheap, local bootleg spirits as a welcome, which was particularly potent. I blacked out during the night but was totally safe, and I came to at a friend's apartment, where a couple of people had also crashed. It was about 6 a.m, and my train had been at 4 a.m, so obviously I panicked. Taking stock, I discovered I had no shoes, and my friend who had come with me had left without me, and taken my purse, phone, and train ticket. I was totally stranded. One of the people who was there was an older guy. He offered to find me some shoes. Feeling a little worse for wear, I let him help me. He wasn't a total random. He worked with the local volunteer who was my friend. He took me to his home, and I noticed toys laying around his front room. He told me that he lived with his parents, so I asked him if they belonged to a sibling. Nope, they were his daughters. None of the shoes fitted me, so we went to a friend of his. She gave me some seriously beaten up Converses, and I offered to pay for them, but she said that she had literally just pulled them out the trash. The guy then took me home. I offered to pay him as he mentioned he was a taxi driver, and it was 40 kilometers. He just told me that I didn't have enough money, and this is where it got weird. He got my phone number off another volunteer who thought she was setting us up. He rang me that night and the next, inviting me for cocktails. I declined politely. The third night, I walked home late from work, totally exhausted, and saw that his car was parked in the car park. I said hi, and he invited me for cocktails again, and said he hadn't known when I was getting home, so he'd driven there and waited for me to get back. He'd waited 3 hours. I again declined, now totally spooked, and rushed inside where my apartment building had security doors. The next night he was there again outside my house. It was raining, so he didn't get out of his car, but he rolled down the window and waved me over, telling me how beautiful I was, and how it was lovely spending time the night before. I went inside again. My phone wouldn't stop ringing that night, with his number each time. The next day I went into my boss's office and found him there chatting to her. He'd come on some official business between the two youth centers, though even my boss, not having a clue on the connection between us, said it was strange that he'd come by, because they normally posted these sort of documents to each other. When she realized the town he was from was the one I'd been to over the weekend, she asked if we'd met. He just looked at me and said, "I thought I recognized you." He phoned that night one last time and asked him why I wasn't talking to him. I pointed out that he'd turned up on my doorstep and at my work unannounced. I didn't know him that well, and he blamed it on me being an uptight English girl. And thankfully, I never heard from him again. When I was 12, we went to Disneyland. We decided to go to the Animal Kingdom, my favorite, because of the exotic animals and all the rides. We had an amazing day doing all the rides, and it was an awesome time, but it started towards the end. I saw the same two men, but thought nothing of it. We started queuing up for some water parade, and as we were queuing it began to rain. It was classic Florida rain, and there was no sign of it clearing, so they cancelled the play. We wanted to see if the rain would dissipate, but after 5 minutes my dad left, but I elected to stay longer. They were adamant on leaving, so we were on our way out and were taking 3 steps when my mother screamed, not a scream of fear, but a scream of pain and sorrow. I turned around. "Lucas," she screamed, half crying, half furious, as we asked everyone if we'd seen him. I never really got on with my brother, but when he disappeared, you think you might never see him again. It's a horrible feeling, like all happiness has disappeared and will never return. I told my mum I was going to do laps around the park, and that we were going to look for him. After my desperate screams, I saw him. He was with the guy I'd seen twice before. I ran to him and my adrenaline kicked in. I raised my fist and hit him clean in the jaw. He let go of my brother and put his hands on his jaw, and I picked my brother and ran off with him. I'm so thankful the guy who got him didn't manage to escape, and I hope we never meet again, you creep. I live in quite a rural region of Germany. Many castles, fields, wineries, and bits of history splattered around my surroundings. Personally, I live in a house that was built around the 50s or 60s. It's fairly old and is already getting cracks in the walls, with mold appearing in several spots with high humidity, which we are obviously trying to get rid of, but it's easier said than done, as it reappears all the time, especially during winter. I don't know that much about my house's history, as it's just an old house like many others in this village. The only remarkable feature about my house being the fact that the former mayor of this village lived here. Now I won't start retelling stories from my childhood, as I was a generally anxious kid who'll get startled by the simplest of things. Being introverted and into art, I'd also have a huge imagination, so I might as well have made some things up. Anyway, it began with simple things that many other people experienced, such as seeing shadow people, dark, faint silhouettes right in the corner of my viewing area. They can be moving or standing there. Nothing to be scared of when you get used to it though I did feel uneasy while being home alone. There were other occasions where I would hear faint voices. They'd usually be calling out my name, which does get awkward when I start asking my family if they were calling me, to find out that they were not. One of the more scary instances was when I heard, "Go away," late in the night, but perhaps I was just tired. But voices are voices and shadows are shadows. Time to get to the more interesting stuff. Certain lights can sometimes turn on without anyone being there and turn off after a while. Others begin to flicker and stop at some point. The latter especially happening very often recently. Certain objects can also sometimes fall down or be misplaced. Another incident involving a light did actually scare the living crap out of me, as it occurred late at night while I was up. It was the mirror in front of my bed. Maybe it was the mirror in front of my bed, maybe the old screws. But as I'm looking at my own reflection, I heard a loud crash as the ceiling lamp came crashing down onto the ground, nearly giving me cardiac arrest. But the cherry on top is what happened here. We used to have this project at our school, where physics students could build a radio. My older brother, being good in physics, decided to build such a radio as well, and it worked. However, it did end up in the back of our wardrobe, as back then we shared a room and stayed there for quite a while. It got quite dusty, so imagine a good and sunny day, my family being at home, and I'm spending my time in my room playing games on my bed. I look in the already mentioned mirror, and the radio starts shrieking with sound. I panic and run into the living room, asking the rest of my family if they heard it. And hell, their confused and perplexed faces did. They asked me whether or not I made that noise, which I obviously didn't, and so I picked up the small radio and brought it into the living room. My brother tells me to open it, as it's powered by batteries. There were no batteries though. It was in fact not intact. My mum, being a superstitious woman, tells me to put it away in the attic, which I did. My younger sister is currently taking classes with the same teachers I used to have, and being a good brother, I did keep all the exams and tests I had, so she could use them to prepare herself for her impending examinations. And where did I keep them? The attic. The radio started screeching again, as my sister was looking for the papers. The same freaking radio. Other than that, it might be worth mentioning that I got cats 2 years ago, and they do sometimes stop mid-walk and stare into nothing, like walls or hallways. One of them does even start to growl, which is also unsettling. I'm 19 years old. I work at a small amusement park in a semi-rural area, which generally will generate a good amount of people coming. This happened during the summer season, so we were open until 9 PM, but we generally only have at most 10 families at around 6:30 to 7. I mostly work outside as a ride attendant, so I get a lot of customer interaction from people all the time and don't usually think much of it. I had to come to work at around 3 PM, and my day was going normally. At 3:30 I was running one of those roller coasters which has a big box for the operator to run the ride from. These two kids show up. One looked around 8 and the other looked 15. They seemed very sweet and funny, so I was just enthusiastically telling them the rules and being as kind as I possibly could so they could enjoy themselves. As soon as the ride would finish, they'd run from the exit right back in line and go again, which isn't unusual because I get kids do that all the time. Sometimes I'll even have kids who do it over and over again for an hour or so. Soon enough, they stopped riding and waved me off as they ran to some other rides to have fun. At some point afterwards, one of my co-workers came up to switch positions with me and set me off to a tilt-a-whirl, which is another ride we have. As I'm walking down, I see from a distance a man wearing a black shirt, standing at our gem mining station. It's just a smallish water town that constantly generates water, so kids can sift through sand and get cool rocks and stuff. He was just holding his hand in the water, so I was going to ignore him as I made my way to my ride. As I'm getting closer, he looks up at me and asks for my name. I couldn't lie about it as I had a name tag on, so I just told him, and proceeds to say, "Do you think I can see you later tonight?" "No," I reply, and walk away to the ride I was operating, and casually told a co-worker about what happened. We laughed it off as if it were nothing, and I sent him on his way to the ride he had to run. Not 5 minutes later, the guy shows up with the two kids who I let on the roller coaster, the one I was previously running. I'm of course not looking forward to letting him on, but toughed it out since the kids were just trying to have fun. They walked up to the entrance of the ride, and I asked the man if he could hold the fence door open as I scanned his wristband. The fence door opened inwards, and the scanner is on the opposite side, so I asked customers to hold it open in order for them not to block it as they go on. Of course, he responds. I'll do anything for you, whatever you want. As I scanned their wristbands, the scanner showed them that they had run out of credits, so I made sure to tell them. The younger kid with him looked upset, and I told them they could go on this ride this one time, and then they could just go talk to the front counter after. I put them on, explained the rules of the ride, and ran it as usual. The entire time that the ride was operating, I noticed the man was staring at me. He never let his eyes off me, so I tried my hardest to avert his gaze. I tried not to seem alarmed, because his kids were in the other carts joking around and making funny faces and gestures at me, trying to make me laugh, so I pretended not to notice. Once the ride had come to a complete stop, the youngest kid stood up and said he wanted to go again. I felt bad for him, and since there weren't any people in line, I told him he could go on again. The older kid felt dizzy, so he just got off the ride while the man and younger child stayed on. It ran again, and I noticed that the man wasn't letting his gaze off me. Towards the end of the ride, I saw he was lifting his lap bar up, so I told him to leave it down, as it acts as a second brake to slow down individual carts. Later, the ride came to a stop. I look over and tell him about the front counter, only to notice that he had put his hands in his pants to make his crotch more noticeable. I was highly disturbed, of course, because I was literally not trying to be forced to look at some dude's excited phase, and I quickly made sure they left and just avoided looking at the man the entire time. After that, I had no more customers, and made sure to go to my supervisor at the time and explain to her what happened. But she didn't know what the guy looked like, just what his older son looked like, and as I was telling her, she saw the older son in the parking lot leave, so we assumed that they were gone for good at that point, and we went back to business as usual. I was still on edge because I was super uncomfortable, but I just spoke to my co-workers to pass the time. At around 6 or so, my supervisor asked me to take cardboard down to the dumpster. I went down alone, and there weren't many people nearby. The dumpster is near some rides, so you could see what was going on from other points in the park. As I'm throwing the cardboard away, I noticed a figure walking down towards the dumpster, and see that it's the same guy from earlier. He'd come back to the park again, and I start to freak out, because I didn't have a walkie-talkie on me, and there wasn't anyone nearby to do anything. He kept walking closer and closer, eyeballing me every so often, as I internally start panicking and getting increasingly nervous. I thought in that moment that I was going to be kidnapped, and I didn't even know what to do. Thankfully, my supervisor saw him from a distance and started speed walking in my direction. She walked right past him before he could get to me, and he did a double take and just stood there as if he wasn't walking towards me. She walked me back up and told me that she didn't know if that was the guy, but didn't want to leave me there alone. She switched me to another ride and said she'd make sure he didn't follow me around. She had told some other co-workers about what happened, and a co-worker from before made sure to stay near me, because the guy kept lingering at areas that I was near, and trying to be near me when he thought my guard was down. Every time my co-worker thought he was getting too close, they'd stand near me to make sure he left me alone. At some point, his youngest kid came to the ride I was operating, and stayed on until closing time came about, so the guy was nearby for a lot of the time. Towards closing, I was offered a ride home from a co-worker because he didn't want me to go to the parking lot alone. As we went outside, we sit on the stairs with some other co-workers, and we noticed this car that was still there. even though at that point we had been closed for 45 minutes. The guy was still there, with his family and everything, just lingering. There were no other cars in the customer car park except for them, so I assumed this dude had to have some of his own family involved, because he was just waiting there. I can't see any other reason he'd be there. It felt too coincidental that his family so happened to stay later than they had to. I kept nervously looking over and looking to see what he was doing, and he was just staring in our direction as he sat while his whole family did other stuff. Thankfully, at some point they had left, but I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable at the thought of it. I was just completely alone when I left. I'm so glad I have some responsible and caring co-workers, because if not, I have no idea what would have happened. I was in 4th grade in the late 80s, although, as kids, we felt mostly invincible. There was this kind of mild horror that surrounds everything. It was the tail end of satanic panic. Getting an apple in your trick-or-treat bag meant razor blade. Every single white van that drove by was trying to take you. My brother and I spent one Sunday sitting on the front porch, crouched behind the wrought iron railing, bored and looking for anything to do. We'd exhausted the library book my mum let us borrow about secret codes. We somehow got it in our head to start writing down license plates and making models of cars. It was mostly curiosity, but we kept seeing this one number over and over again. Of course, it was a white van. We told our parents, and they kind of exchanged glances. My dad asked us to describe the driver, and he said he knew the guy. Our town was small, so it made sense. Thinking back, I'm betting he just didn't want us to worry. Also, who writes down license plate numbers? We were weirdos. The morning after, I heard my dog barking in the way he did when he was angry and defensive. He only did this when there was a threat nearby, and all the adults were acting off. It was whispered, but my uncle told my dad, "I'm staying home from work. Someone is watching the house." The flyer that they passed around my class that day had a police sketch type drawing of a guy who was a suspicious person hanging around the school. The flyer said, "To be aware and don't let your children walk home alone." The drawing looked like any other regular guy. Our parents made us memorize code words in case someone non-family needed to pick us up. I usually walked home, but my mum stopped letting me. At school we had this thing at recess. The doors at the school were super heavy and locked from the inside as soon as they closed. So our teacher would have one of us hold the door for the 20-minute period while everyone else was running around. It was somewhat of a status symbol among 9-year-olds. Whoever was holding the door was very important. During recess, kids would come up and chat with you, and it was understood that you were like the assistant teacher in a sense. My friends kept coming up and telling me that a guy was throwing rocks from the woods. They were excited and terrified, and it didn't take long for teachers to notice and quickly usher the class back inside. The next day, we went up behind the baseball diamond. It was creepy near the woods, but you could see the houses beyond the line of trees, so I figured we were okay. I remember my best friend shouting, and there were dozens of polaroids scattered on the ground near the pitcher's mound. They were all of kids, some repeats, some different. The only common thing was that all of the faces were scribbled out violently with a black Sharpie. I didn't want to touch them. It made me feel sick and dizzy. We went home and told our parents. They mostly rolled their eyes at us and said we were being dramatic. My mum seemed concerned, but I don't think anything ever came of it, and when I ask her now, she apparently doesn't remember. I have been going to Disneyland since I was 5, and am now 18. I was at the park once when I was 13 with my mum and my sister, and we elected to go on the Haunted Mansion. So we wait in line, get on the ride. My mum and sister got on one doom buggy, and I got on another by myself. We go through the ride, and everything is going great until we reach the hitchhiking ghost part of the ride near the end. This is where things get good. Right when we enter the room, the ride stops. Okay, they stopped the ride all the time. They're just helping someone off, I said. So I'm sitting there waiting for the ride to start up again when I suddenly feel someone push on my right shoulder. I could clearly feel a palm and fingers when I got pushed, and I spin around really quick to look, but see no one. It couldn't have been my mom or my sister, because when you enter the room, the cars turn left, and if they tried to touch me, they wouldn't have been able to reach me if they did. Then it would have been on my left shoulder. It also couldn't have been the people behind me, because the doom buggies behind me were in a straight line, and they also wouldn't have been able to reach me. The only way for them to touch me is if they'd have gotten out of their car and to push me, but I would have caught them climbing back into the car. It couldn't have been a cast member, because they would have had to have walked right in front of me to even get to the side of my doom buggy, and I would have seen them, of course. The next day, I hop onto the computer and start doing some research about deaths in the park and ghosts. And no sooner had I started looking, did I stumble across a story about a kid that perished on the ride. According to the story, the kid was at the park attending grad night. While on the ride, he decided to exit his doom buggy and walk around and view the different rooms and special effects. While he was doing this, he came upon a staircase that he did not see and fell down the stairs. The stairs were painted black, so it was impossible to see them unless you had a flashlight. He broke his neck, and that was the end. Since then, people have reported cold spots and being touched or shoved in the hitchhiking ghosts section of the ride. When I read that, I thought to myself, I just experienced a ghost. In my many visits back to the park after that, I always hoped that I would experience something like that again, but I never, ever did. A while back, when I was 14 or so, a group of friends and I went out downtown to do a bit of cosplay photo shoot. We were all dressed pretty crazy, so it wasn't a huge surprise that it drew in a bit of attention. Not a big deal really. We were cool with answering questions about what we were doing and all. We went to a market in the center of downtown for lunch, and once we finished, half of us went to the washroom and the others waited outside the market and began discussing the best place to take photos. A man approaches us, wanting to know if there was an event going on and why we were dressed that way. A second older man also approached us, standing next to the first guy, and just listens to our conversation. As our conversation dies down, the older man begins to act kind of weird, fidgety, and twitching awkwardly, and looking around quickly. Then he smiles at me very creepily and asks if he could kiss me. My immediate reaction as a 14-year-old boy with major anxiety is to quietly say, "No thank you," and hope that was the end of it. It wasn't. The older man takes a step towards me again and asks, adding a please. My friend asks the other younger man if he knew the guy, and if they could please leave us alone. The guy apologizes and says he doesn't know the dude, but tries to tell him he should leave us alone. The older man is having none of it, ignoring everyone and taking another step towards me, now demanding that I let him kiss me. I said no again, taking a step back, and suddenly the guy nearly lunges at me. I bolted back into the market, trying to hide in the large crowd, making my way upstairs and collapsing in a corner to cry. Because that whole experience at 14 is absolutely horrifying. My friends eventually found me, calmed me down, and we decided that the market wasn't a safe place to be in at the moment. So we left, walking to a mall about 7 to 8 blocks away. We walk around for a bit, and I'm finally enjoying myself and calmed down, until I turn the corner to see the same old creep from earlier walking 10 feet behind us. As soon as he notices that I saw him, he gives the same creepy smile as before and begins his approach towards us. We scatter, running off, finally losing him and deciding it would be best to go home and do this photo shoot another day somewhere safer. I was about 10 years old in Disneyworld. It was my second time going, and I was finally tall enough to ride the rock and roller coaster. My parents and I were in line, and we got through pretty quickly because there weren't a ton of people in that line that day. We got to the part of the line where we had to go in an elevator to get to the actual docking point. We were in there with one other lady. This is the creepy lady. She was mid-30s and a little bit chubby. I like to move a lot, so I wasn't standing directly next to my parents, which was a mistake. This lady talked to us immediately. That in itself isn't that strange. We figured that she was just social, and she started telling us about her kids and her whole life story. As if that wasn't strange enough, she grabbed me and pulled me back against her as I was facing the other way and hugged me from behind. At this point, I'm extremely uncomfortable, and my parents are unsettled as well. My mum tells me to come here, but the lady just says something along the lines of, "Oh, she doesn't care, we're friends, right?" Once the elevator opened, she let me go. My parents and I walked away pretty fast. It was a pretty unnerving experience. I grew up in a very rural area in the Appalachians. There was no town for half an hour or longer drive in any direction. No traffic lights, just back roads and terrifying houses, and a lot of forest. I grew up without limited electricity, water, and all of that jazz, as did most of the people around me. We had a set of well-off retirees move in pretty close to my house on the opposite side of the mountain. They built a fancy house on the other side of the mountain and had a good long winding 1 mile long driveway from the main mountain road. I knew the neighbors simply as Steve and Joanne. Steve and Joanne ended up getting custody of 3 of their grandchildren when I was about 3 years old, and they were very young and had developmental delays. One was deaf, one was a quadriplegic, and the youngest, Jonathan. I'm not exactly sure what was wrong with him, but he was slow, wore a helmet and that kind of thing, but I was too little to know. Since we lived in an old, unsettled territory, where there is a ton of exposed wells from old foundations and cabins, my dad was always very cautious about where I played, because of the danger of them. And despite Steve and Joanne's precautions, and no one apparently knows how, Jonathan got outside one day, wandered out into the woods, and fell in one of those wells. It happened to be one that had water in it, and he drowned. I was around 5 years old, and I remember hearing when the cops found his body that he had drowned, and how inconceivable that was to me as a kid. I went to the funeral as well, and after this, the family built a large, gated deck around the house that was airtight to protect the kids just in case. It was a huge project, and an absolutely gigantic locked gate. My mum hung out with the family pretty often, so I was dragged over there for quite a few years until I was 8 or so. She would do work for them like clean their house or milk their goats, and I just wandered on the creepy deck on the side of the mountain and felt very unsettled. I got those feelings a lot as a kid, and to tell the truth I had forgotten about the little boy who died. But anyway, I just remember being in the house and hating it there. Then one day, Steve and Joanne just up and left. They left everything and moved to Alaska. That was the rumor anyway. But the house sat empty. I used to see the house through the woods when I was out exploring, and I remember it because none of my dogs would ever go towards the house at all. I could sometimes hear these loud scrapes and booms. Think of a sound that a tin sheet would make if you stomped on it, and it felt like the empty house was looking back at me. I attributed the sound to bears or deers or other loud animals and avoided it. One day I was about 10 years old and saw an old truck peel into the driveway. I alerted my father, who grabbed his gun and jumped into his truck. He's a pretty aggressive, paranoid mountain man, and he followed the truck up, and when he returned I asked him who it was, and he refused to talk to me. But sneaky me pretended to play outside, but was actually outside the window listening as he told my mum what happened. The men in the other truck were 2 of Steve's sons. They had told my dad they were there to get one final look at the house that they helped build, because it was being sold, and they apparently asked my dad if he had ever gotten a weird feeling from the house. My dad said no, and as he explained it to my mum, he said while they were out there helping build that deck, that they heard the sound of kids running around the planks, and that one time he saw a shadow fall over his back, and the shadow was a young kid wearing a helmet. This absolutely petrified me, and I never told anyone what I heard. Fast forward a few years. When I was 12, I got really into horseback riding. However, after a few months of near misses from idiotic speeding drivers on the road, my dad had enough and banned me to mountain trail riding only. In his opinion, it was safer. I would have agreed at this point, if he would have let me carry a knife or gun. The most convenient trail was the mile-long dirt driveway to the abandoned house. Fair enough. I didn't have to ride the whole driveway and see the house. I could just go back and forth along the winding road and turn back before I reached the end of the driveway. So one day I was doing this and got braver and braver. Eventually I decided I would ride my horse up to the last turn, which was level with the house and where everyone parked their cars. I guess I was curious and just wanted to see this place up close now, as it had gotten dilapidated and the grand deck was looking pretty moldy. The driveway end was all overgrown, which my horse was really excited about. We were doing walks and trots for a good hour or two. His name was Tennessee. He was all sweaty and wet, and we walked up to the end of the driveway and immediately went for the tall grass, dipping his head down to about knee level to reach it, nibbling away. I know I was going to be in trouble for letting him eat grass, but I had to mention before anything else that this horse was not skittish. He was middle-aged and had been rodeo trick horse trained, and was not afraid of wimpy horse scary things like loud noises or cars. He was intelligent, and definitely the best trained animal I'd ever owned. He could even rear in a circle on his hind legs. It's one of those rodeo tricks. In any case, we were there for a good 5 minutes. The air was still, the day was hot, and the sun was shining. I was staring ahead. The house was to my right, and the horse and I were perpendicular to it, down the mountain and just zoning out. I admit that I felt watched like I always did when I was near the house, but since I felt that way 99% of the time as a kid, it was easily ignored. But then, I heard running footsteps in the empty house. I turned my head to look, and when I did, I got this insane feeling of dread. I half expected a bear to rush at me. The worst part is, just as this feeling hit me, my horse abruptly stopped his chewing and tensed up. I could feel it. His head shot to the right as well as his ears pointing forwards. That's when I internally went, "Oh shit," because the confirmation from my horse was that this whole thing was real. We stared at the house in unison, footsteps getting stronger, and the feeling of dread gradually getting worse. And then suddenly, a scraping noise like metal on metal. There was a huge swamp cooler in the large kitchen window, which got pulled inside as we stood there. I saw it wiggle, and bang, it fell and all the doors and windows shook. Whatever had been walking inside lifted this immensely huge thing and pushed it inwards, because it wouldn't push outwards. When the swamp cooler disappeared, my horse straight up bolted. He had never done that before or since, even after being near gunshots and wild boars, but he took off in a dead run, and I just let him go. I was absolutely terrified, and I remember hearing his hooves thundering along the dirt and gravel, and hearing the wind and my own heartbeat, and just this ungodly roaring, almost like a lion or a bear. Anyway, that's the story. Make of it what you will. I very slyly told my dad that I had seen the swamp cooler missing from the window, and he went over to check, then said the house had been ransacked but nothing was stolen. He said it was human. There were no evidence of animals being inside, but the cabinets were opened and the food and belongings were thrown around. He was angry, thinking it was a vandal, but he said all the doors were locked and the windows intact. This happened when I was around the age of 14. I went to a theme park, Great America, with my older sister who was around the age of 17. She pestered me to go on a ride that I was not comfortable riding at the time, until I finally budged and said I'd go with her. While we stood in line, she and I heard an older dude yelling about his favorite sports team to seemingly nobody. He was with a group of girls, so we assumed he was just having a good time with his friends, but that wasn't the case. Anyway, she and I got on the ride from start to finish. The ride itself was a pirate ship that basically swung back and forth, similar to a pendulum, and eventually started to do complete circles, causing the passenger to hang temporarily upside down. The ride itself isn't really that key to the story, besides the nauseous feeling after the ride. Once I was done, I noticed that the girls that were previously with this dude left because he was yelling and acting a weirdo. I didn't really pay much attention to them because my stomach was acting up, but I guess I should have. At the time, she and I were standing on the top of a bridge, and I told her that I needed a minute. I walked over to the railing of the bridge and leaned over to get some fresh air, basically just trying to feel normal again to ensure I wouldn't throw up on the next ride. And this is when things got weird. While leaning over the railing, I feel big arms suddenly wrap around my waist, and I'm hoisted into the air. Initially, I'm freaked out and trying to comprehend what exactly is happening. All I know is that I'm up in the air, and I'm not sure why. Was whoever had me going to throw me over the bridge? I'm stuck there in fear, and just as quickly as it starts, I'm placed back down onto the ground. I whip around to see the same creepy dude standing there smiling at me. My sister runs over to stand beside me and asks this dude why he'd lifted me into the air. I was in a state of shock and couldn't really speak at the time, with all of this and the nauseousness and all. The following conversation then ensued. "Why did you lift him into the air?" "He looked like he was sick and needed some fresh air." "Tell me how lifting someone in the air is going to help with a sickness." "How you doing?" He tried talking to me at this point. I ignored him, and my sister was doing all the talking. Come on, kid. Look at someone when they talk to you. You bored or something? I bet you're bored on these rides with your sister? Friend? Doesn't matter. I heard her screaming her lungs out on the ride we all went on, and I bet she doesn't even want to go on more scary rides. She's no fun. You'll probably have to go home soon because of her. Note: my sister was screaming a lot on the ride, but she told me that she screams on the rides because it raises her adrenaline levels and causes her to have more fun. Leave him alone. What we do is none of your business. But it is. I want everyone that comes to this park to have a good time. I mean, it's great America. Tell you what, kid, how about you and I go to the water park and ditch your little friend here? She's not going to have much fun getting wet anyway, but trust me, I will. We can both go on the water rides that you want, and afterwards I'll take you wherever you want to grab lunch. I don't know what you all think about an old random man asking a 14-year-old to go out with him, but I instantly thought this dude was trying to take me. So, I feel that this guy is a danger to myself and possibly my sister, so I made a movement to walk away from him. He subtly stepped in front of me to block my exit, again standing on a bridge, so I had to think of another way that I could pass him, and I feign a phone call from my parents and say, "Hi, Mum. Oh yeah, we're fine, just getting off the pirate ship ride." "What? You're right near the food court? Oh okay, we're coming, see you in a sec." I said it loud enough that the creep could hear everything that transpired, and with my newfound confidence, pushed past this guy. We walked away from him and into the direction that I faked my mother was waiting. After about 15 seconds of walking, we broke out into a sprint until we reached the park entrance. We tried to tell the front desk people about the guy, but they said since nothing really happened, they couldn't do anything. This occurred when I was about 7 to 8 years old, and is a story that I only just recently remembered. It was summertime, and my mum was having a garage sale in our driveway. Her, me, my brother, who was aged 4 or 5 at the time, and my grandmother, my mother's mum, were all seated inside of the garage during the sale. Me and my brother, of course, had been playing a bit though, running from our yard and then back to our driveway and such. We had a few visitors, but it was one woman who was responsible for this story. She was older, about 70-something, and walked with a limp. I remember this because she had a cane. She was on foot and was carrying nothing but a small red toolbox. Not a lunchbox, a literal metal toolbox. She carried things inside of that you could hear clanging around. My dad had one just like it when I was a kid, that I wasn't allowed to touch because he was a plumber and didn't want me or my brother near his expensive tool set. So I found it strange that she was just walking around with it. She didn't greet us. She just started picking things up and looking at them. My mum decided to initiate conversation, and this is how it went. "Hi, good morning. Do you have anything for free?" "Excuse me?" "Items I can pick up. Like this. Is this for free?" "No, sorry. Everything has a sticker on it with a price." "Why is it not free?" It's a garage sale. I'm trying to sell things." It was at this point the lady went quiet, and my mum just stood up staring at her. My grandma called me and my brother to sit behind her, and we watched and waited for something else to happen. The woman set her toolbox on one of our tables and opened it up to reveal a bunch of random things. Little trinkets, loose change, actual tools. She had everything from Kleenex to quarters. It was weird. She motioned towards a small group of figurines my mum was selling and asked if she could have one for free. At this point, my mum was getting annoyed and wanted this lady to leave. She said so, and the woman started walking towards us. She said something about how cute me and my brother were as we sat ducking behind my grandmother's chair. She started walking into our garage, and my mum told her to stop and repeated that she should leave. She said something else about me and my brother, and asked if we liked her trinkets while she stood staring at us. And my grandma chimed in that she would call the police if the woman didn't leave. She then slowly turned around, walking back to her toolbox, lifting up one of the figurines and very obviously putting it in the box without paying for it. My mum didn't fight her, just told her to leave now. So she did. She wandered up and down our street away from our driveway, but within eyesight. We kept an eye on her for the rest of the day as she roamed around our neighborhood and surrounding streets until she finally left. It was super weird, and us kids were advised not to leave our garage sale for the rest of the day. The story continues. About a week later, when me and my brother were playing outside again. We have landscaping around our house, which are rocks that have flower planters and birdhouses, nothing too spectacular, and it wasn't unusual for me and my brother to climb and stand on these rocks as kids. We started walking around my house to do this, and then went inside to get a drink or something of a sort. We weren't gone for more than a few minutes when we came back outside and returned to the exact spot that we had just been in, and immediately noticed that woman with the same bright red toolbox sitting on top of one of the rocks in our landscape. I ran back inside with my brother to inform our parents. My dad went outside to retrieve the toolbox, and it was the same that the woman had had, with her items still stored inside. I hadn't seen her since the garage sale, still never have, but somehow she managed to leave that toolbox there without being noticed, which meant she had to have been watching and waiting for the ideal moment. The creepiest part is that our yard is away from our garage. In order to get to that part of our landscaping, you would have to go up our driveway and literally walk across the entire length of our lawn in front of our house, and then to the side in order to place it there, since we have thick hedges blocking the rest of our yard from the public. We have 2 big windows on the front and side of our house that were open, which just creeps me out more when I think she could have been watching us from the outside. I don't remember what my parents did with said toolbox. I'm pretty sure they threw it away. None of us have seen that woman again. Also, there's no chance that we missed the toolbox the first time round. It was bright red and literally within our walking path, and I noticed it was there as soon as I turned the corner of our yard. There was no missing it. I don't know what her intentions were, but I'm glad we haven't encountered her since. Toolbox lady, let's not meet again. I was around 15, and I was on vacation at Walt Disney World sometime during the summer. My family has the vacation club membership, so we go a few times a year and live nearby. We were staying in the vacation club villas, which is a separate building from the main hotel. I brought 2 of my friends, Savannah and Victoria, and we got bored at around 2 a.m, so we went down to the gym. We weren't even going to work out. We were just going to take mirror selfies and mess around with the exercise balls. There's a desk for the spa portion of the gym, and since it was late there were no employees. So we were messing around behind the desk and found a notebook. I'm not sure why, I was super annoying at the time, but I decided to write my Twitter and Instagram handles, and did. Looking back, I'm pretty sure we could get in trouble since guests aren't supposed to mess around with the desks. I didn't think much of it as we left the gym, and the next morning we checked out of the hotel. On the drive back home, I get a Twitter notification, and it's from a diaper fetish account. The creepy thing is this account was active for a while and had disgusting pictures of grown men in diapers and other disturbing pictures of children. So does Savannah, and we both wrote our names in that book. We both sit there looking at each other. The account tweeted at us saying something like, "I know who you are and what you've done, and your vacation will end abruptly." They tweeted some more creepy stuff like that, telling us to watch our backs, but I knew it was clearly because we left our names on the notepad. I didn't reply. Then I noticed a new follower, and it was my name, but the username was similar to the diaper account. The account started tweeting my address, phone number, and random pictures of me from deep in my social media. They do the same thing with Savannah's name, and at this point we're both crapping ourselves. I receive a text from a random number, and I'm assuming they used a texting app saying that they were watching us and knew more than we thought. They even started texting me about my boyfriend at the time and asked me really messed up questions about him. I told them to piss off and blocked it. I didn't get any more texts, but the Twitter account continued to tweet about me, random details that I know they had to dig deep to find. I blocked them on that too, and put all my accounts on private. I never got any more messages, but the Twitter accounts are still up to this day. So to the Disney employee with a diaper fetish, stay away from me. Growing up, we moved every year. I can say that in my life I have lived in at least 20 homes. Only one of them I actually experienced anything in. This would have been in 5th grade, so I was probably around 10, and I had 2 younger brothers who were around 4 and 6, and my parents. The house was just a simple 1-story in a normal neighborhood built in the 70s. This was 1999, so none of the houses were terribly old, some even renovated. It was a hit-and-miss middle-class family neighborhood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. My parents both worked during the day, so since my brothers didn't yet go to school full-time, my grandma, who also lived in the neighborhood, would take care of them during the day, and I went home after school. As I was the last one to leave in the morning, I knew to turn everything off and lock up before I went to school. One day, I came home to find the shower was running. I thought it was weird, but didn't dwell on it much further, as I wanted to drop my stuff off and get back outside. Then it happened again for the next few days. I went around and checked all of the doors and windows, but everything was locked. I told my mum about it, but she kind of brushed it off. I would find out later that she brushed it off because she didn't want anything involved in the paranormal about the house. A little bit later, I was laying in bed starting to fall asleep when I felt something crawling on me. It felt like a light-footed cat over my sheets. I was too afraid to look, so I just lay there while this thing crawled across my bed, on and off of me. I never did look at it. This being an older house, the registers were on the floor, and I didn't sleep with a window open or a fan on, so it wasn't wind blowing my blanket around. One thing I've never been able to figure out is how my little brother's Mickey Mouse toy would work with no batteries. I mean, it's not like we took them out and it would work for an hour. This thing had no batteries for months and continued to function fully. This same little brother was also caught by my mum multiple times talking to himself in his room. When my mum would ask him who he was talking to, he would simply reply with, "The old man." Whatever, kids have imaginary friends. But one night I heard hissing. I got up and looked out my door to see my little brother hissing like a cat at the top of the fridge. I went and got my mum, who rushed out of bed and kept telling him to stop. She started crying, and my dad rushed into the kitchen and finally started shaking him. He would not break his eyes from the top of the fridge. Finally, my dad literally shook him out of it, and he looked at my dad with the biggest smile and said something along the lines of, "He's gone now," and started laughing. We only lived in that house for a few more months after that. But the one other incident I will bring up is when my family went out to dinner and run errands one night. I was eating at a friend's house and didn't want to go, so I went home after dinner around 8, as they still weren't home. It was dark out by now, so I went inside and turned on the TV. I was sitting there for a while when I thought I heard whispering. I couldn't make out what it was, but didn't care. I just wanted to ignore it so it would go away. It came to a point in lull in between the TV, where the show ends and before the commercial begins, and I heard it clearly. "Hey." It was so close to my right ear that it could have been a person. I felt the breath on the side of my face. I booked it out the door and sat outside until my parents got home. Not wanting to scare anyone, I told them I was outside watching the fireflies, and I got yelled at for leaving the TV and lights on while being outside. Again, 20 plus homes and only one with paranormal activity. There were always little things that would happen. Lights would turn on and off, some light voices, and shadows coming from the corner of your eye. It certainly creeped me out, and I'm glad that we no longer reside there. It was around 12 a.m, and I was sitting by myself at a cosplay rave, in the chairs, instead of dancing, while my friends were in the crowd. This is because I tire very easily, and do enjoy listening to the music and watching people have fun. A guy dressed as a certain Jedi came up to me. I'd met him earlier. He found me sitting off to the side of a hallway in a corner recharging, and tried to strike up a conversation. I'd faced away the entire time and gave him one-word replies because I was clearly tired and uninterested. I have autism and get worn down quickly, especially in crowds, and I informed the guy that I was tired. A guy friend running a DJ booth nearby came over when he noticed the unwanted company, hugged and kissed me on the cheek while shooing away the Jedi look-alike. He told me later he wanted to send the guy "she's taken" vibes to ward him off. However, the Jedi guy was unfazed. He did eventually wander away to an event, much to my relief. But here he was again, somehow able to recognize me under my new character's extreme face makeup, although I hardly recognized him. I wouldn't have, as I'm nearly face blind, if it wasn't for the costume. It was pretty dark in the rave too. He asked me if I wanted to dance and I said no, but he insisted. I continued saying no. Then he asked me if I wanted to go up to his hotel room with him. Again, no. He didn't like my answer, so he grabbed my wrist and yanked me out of my chair and started dragging me towards the exit. As I pulled back hard in clear resistance like a game of tug-of-war with my arm as the rope, but it wasn't working. So I balled my free hand into a fist and started mentally counting down from 5, because I was just about to happily sucker punch him in his face. The 5-second countdown buffer was to give him a chance to stop being stupid, though I really should have just given it to him straight away. I'm small but have taken martial arts, and have no problem crossing justified sucker punch off my list. As soon as I hit 1, my friends showed up for their routine checkup on the introvert, and they all have looks of horror drawn on their faces. He lets go immediately and took off into the crowd. I knew I should have started my countdown earlier, and thankfully that was the last I saw of that creeper. This happened about 6 years ago, when I lived in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville is a pretty ghetto city for the most part, and when this happened to me, I lived right smack in the middle of one. Across the street from my house, there was a neighborhood park, and it was always bursting with numerous children, as parks usually do. The day this happened was a nice sunny afternoon. The park had a water spout and everything, and it was up and running, and of course, little naive me was over there living it up. However, something seemed off. For one, I was literally the only kid in the park. Where was everyone else? I couldn't say. There were no special events going on. It was just a sunny day, so you'd expect there to be scores of kids, but no. I was the only soul there. Not even anyone out on their porches or anything. Even my dad was inside minding his own business. No cars were out driving either. It was eerie as hell. I've established the setting, and I'm standing there all alone playing in the water, with not another person to be found anywhere except for the maintenance waterman. I'm standing right on the water spout, soaking up all the H2O, and in my blurred vision I see a man of 5'9" approaching. I immediately back out of the water and rub my eyes to get a look at him. He's about 40 to 50 years old. He's clearly approaching me, and I stand there and let him address me. Mind you, I'm a little kid, and like I said, I was naive, so I'm trying to be polite and not ignore an adult. "Having fun?" he says. "Yeah." Great. You mind coming and helping me with something? I need to get some work done on these pipes, and I could use your help. I simply reply by saying, contemplating if I should trust this man or not. Noticing my ambivalence, he starts towards me again, as if he's gonna grab my wrist and take me with him, saying things like, "Come on, it'll only be a minute." He's about 6 feet from me, when I turn around and bolt towards my house across the street. I don't even look back to see if he's giving chase. I just run. I made it across, darted inside, and told my dad. We both look out, but he's nowhere to be seen. I didn't know who this guy was, and I didn't see if he was a well-known predator on the news or something. Was he the reason no one else was out there that day? Did everyone else know that he had been spotted? Was he really a maintenance man who needed a 9-year-old's help? I don't know, but I do know that the water maintenance man at the park on Rodman Street in Louisville, Kentucky. So let's not meet again. Back around 2011, I had a girlfriend, who is now my ex, who really wanted to experience something paranormal. Myself and my family had experiences, as did hers. So now she was stoked about seeing something too. She decided that she wanted to do a really stereotypical thing. Let's go to a graveyard in the early hours of the morning and see if we can catch something on film or audio in a picture. I was against this, because at the time we were living with my father, who was in ill health. I'd always heard it was possible for things to follow you home, so I didn't want to do anything that could make his health worse. However, she was the kind of person that couldn't be talked out of something after making up her mind. Knowing how dangerous an area like this can be in the early hours, I ultimately went with her, as there are a lot of drunks leaving pubs and walking through this area. We spent the better part of 3.5 hours wandering around the graveyard before we found absolutely nothing. So we decided to go back home and spent a few hours watching TV before falling asleep. As we went to bed extremely late into the morning, we didn't wake up until around 11:30. We sat and spoke about the night before, how it was a shame that nothing happened, and then moved on to talk about our family's experiences. During this time, I started getting dressed. I put on my clothes and was sat on the bottom corner of my bed putting my shoes on. When, as we were talking, we heard a familiar crack as the door opened. My girlfriend's face lit up with a shocked expression as she was not dressed. In one single impressive movement, she jumped up and pulled the duvet from underneath her and covered herself with it. I looked over towards the door, puzzled, as we were the only people in the house that could get upstairs, as my dad had extremely bad legs covered in large, deep wounds that would not heal. The handle came down and stayed down as the door slowly opened. After about 4 seconds, the door had opened about 3/4 before the handle slowly came back up, halfway before snapping back as if someone had let go of it. Slowly it opened all the way, and I could see there was nobody on the other side. At this point, I had a huge grin on my face, partially from shock as I realized something else wasn't right. There was no noise leading up to this. The house is old. The floorboards and staircase are both completely shot, and if someone was heading towards the room, we would hear them without a doubt. Looking at me, she asked, "Who's there?" All I could say was, "No one." Eventually, I did leave the room to check the house. It was just the 3 of us. No one else was there, and my dad, of course, hadn't moved from downstairs. Around half an hour of this went by, and I went to our local shop to pick up a few bits. I brought 2 Rustler burgers as a quick breakfast for us before we went out. My ex stood talking to me in the kitchen as she watched me place the burgers in the microwave, with each on a separate small plate side by side, taking up almost all the room on the base of the microwave. After a minute or so, I looked through the door and saw something I wasn't expecting. The plates that I put in side by side were now stacked on top of each other, right in the middle. I didn't say a word. Blank-faced, I pulled out both plates, as they were, and looked at my girlfriend. Her jaw dropped. "I know you didn't put them in like that, I saw you," she said. After this, doors would begin to open without anyone being on the other side. This became a common occurrence for 6 months, and pretty much became a normal part of everyday life. I remember it happening when my friend was there. We sat playing FIFA on the Xbox, when suddenly we heard a crack. My friend looked around and said, "Your door just opened," to which I replied, "Yeah, it does that." I made a public post about looking for a space to rent in the city where I work. Rather than replying to the post, a throwaway account with no picture and an obviously fake name messaged me directly saying, "Call this number." For some reason, the short message in combination with the account already felt off. About 10 hours after I received the message, I called. He answered first ring with an oddly cheerful voice and gave a totally different name that was listed in the account and offered no explanation. While he seemed particularly keen to have me come and check out the space, he said that it could not be on a weekday, when I could easily pop by after work, but specifically had to be a weekend. When I started explaining I lived rather far away currently, and asked if it was possible to meet during the week, he insisted it wasn't, and added that I couldn't pass up a spot that was only a mile away from where I work. I never told him where I worked. It's certainly possible that he Googled me, but from start to finish, everything felt very wrong indeed. I was 16 at the time, and my first job was at a local amusement park. At the time, I weighed around 120 pounds and was 5'7". It was a pretty boring and lonely job. My boss never let me talk to the other workers in the other shops. That's why she moved me to one of the retail shops all the way across the park, which is pretty dangerous because I have no one else around me. I was standing outside the entrance to my shop to get some fresh air, and I saw a guy walking by with a really nice camera. I asked him a few questions about it, since I was trying to save up to buy a GoPro for my trip to the Dominican Republic that summer. We striked up a conversation about the camera, and then it started to rain. He came into my shop and looked around while I was just hanging out at my register. This man was about 50 to 60 years old and pretty nice, but this is when things got a little weird. He asked me what I wanted to do when I got older. At the time, I wanted to be a special effects makeup artist, so that's what I told him. He said that he had a friend that needed someone to do makeup for him for this movie. Then he asked if I was interested, and I had to come up with some excuse as to why I didn't want to do it or give him my personal email address, which he asked for. I told him that my mum wouldn't allow me to do that, especially with a man that I didn't know. I bet you're all wondering why I didn't call security or anything like that. Well, I can't call security unless I feel threatened, which I didn't. This guy was very calm and collected, but downright creepy. When I stopped talking to him for a bit to text my manager at the time, he walked over to my register and just stayed there, trapping me in the corner. I quickly text my manager, "Help, there's a guy in my store that won't leave," and I tried to do that quickly so that he wouldn't see. After standing at my register for a few minutes in silence, he walked over to the wall to look at stuff and pretended to be occupied while other customers walked in. That's when he asked to take a photo of me. I got so weirded out, I said, "Sure," and he snapped the picture. I gave this really weird look in it, because I was truly weirded out, and a few minutes after, my manager walked in to tell me that we were going to close. I was so happy, but that's not the end of it. It was 9 at night, and the man wouldn't leave, even when my manager was in there. He stayed there for 2 more hours, and it wasn't until 11 when my manager kind of told him to leave, that he walked out, and she turns to me. "Was that your dad?" "Hell no, I don't even know the guy." She was shocked and very creeped out, as was I. I closed the garage door to the shop and stayed inside to count the money. And as soon as we were about to leave, we look outside the window to see if he's still there. And he was. He was waiting in his vehicle for me to leave. We had to call some of the other managers down to where I was in the pouring rain to escort me to the building on the other side of the park. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I'd have walked back to the building alone. Maybe he would have taken me, or tried to do something unspeakable. But I really don't want to know. I am just so thankful my manager and everyone else who helped me through that nightmare was there. And for the record, I quit right after that.